The People's Platform, as heard at home.
Today, a debate on the most pressing question facing the American people. Should the draft be restored now? Editor Walter Millis says yes. Attorney O. John Rogge says no. Dwight Cook is chairman of the People's Platform. His guests, Walter Millis, editorial writer for the New York Herald Tribune, author of many books on international affairs, including The Road to War, and O. John Rogge, former special assistant to the Attorney General and member of the National Committee for Henry Wallace. For the People's Platform debate, should the draft be restored now, we hear first from Dwight Cook.
Mr. Millis, do you think that a draft is absolutely necessary right now?
Yes, Mr. Cook, I do. I think it is necessary and right now. It seems to me that we have reached a serious and immediate crisis in the post-war period. It is a diplomatic crisis. We have been endeavoring to meet it by the means of diplomacy. I think the results as they stand now show that behind that diplomacy we have to have something more. We have to have a sense of resolution on our own part. We have to have some force, some power to back up our diplomats. And I think we must get it by filling the ranks of our armed services now, and I think the draft is the only way in which that can be done promptly.
But you see the draft, then, Mr. Millis, primarily as a weapon of diplomatic warfare, not of military warfare.
I certainly do. I think no one can say what the future is going to hold under any circumstances. I cannot say definitely that the men we might draft now would never be used in war. Nobody can say that. But the reason for drafting them now, to my mind, would be to back up our diplomatic arm.
I can't help but feel, Mr. Cook and Mr. Millis, that the crisis is not as you describe it. And furthermore, I see the proposed draft as following still more of the blueprint for fascism. You know, my father left Germany because he didn't like the militarism that they had there. Now we are proposing to give the same thing to our sons. I can't help but feel that the big business and military men who are in control of our government and are dictating our foreign policy have, in an insidious way, given us the kind of a reaction that is but a short step from fascism, and I feel that they are prepared to take that step if necessary to protect the excessive profits and the special privileges of the few. As the complete bankruptcy of the Truman Doctrine becomes apparent to all the world, what do we have? The big business, military-minded administration is asking for more arms and more men, not to bolster the United Nations, but, if you please, to support reaction, feudalism, and fascism everywhere in the world. I, for one, am fed up with it.
You don't feel, then, Mr. Rogge, that there's any great threat today from Russian communism or world communism? There's no need of measures to countervene that.
I think the danger in this country is not from communism, but from fascism. We already have incipient fascism, and we're going to get more. We're no longer a free people in this country. I want to see us stay a free people.
I can't help wondering, Mr. Rogge, why you speak of fascism so insistently when the most immediate, most important example of a draft army we now have is found in the Soviet totalitarian state. Of course, I don't think that...
The first thing I'd say to that, if you're right about that, do we have to copy him? We're a free people, Mr. Millis. Why don't we stay that way?
We do not have to copy the Russians. I merely asked why you do not suggest that communism is also using the draft. But I have a further question, Mr. Rogge. I see no evidence whatever to support your statement that the big business interests, the interests of privilege, are primarily behind this move.
Mr. Millis, I have to say but one word in answer to that, and that's Palestine. The real situation in Palestine, and why aren't we honest enough to say it? You talk about big business. I remember looking into the question just about a year ago, and I found there was as much oil in the area surrounding the Gulf there, the Persian Gulf, as there is in the United States and Russia put together, and American oil companies already had half of it, and I dare say they now have more. And I can't help but feel that the real policy of the administration is to protect the oil interests of the American companies, and for that, the lives of many more human beings are expendable.
Yes, Mr. Rogge, but you haven't the slightest evidence that any oil company has put any pressure whatever on Secretary Marshall or on President Truman to recommend the draft. There is no support for that. The oil we are getting from the Far East is not primarily for military purposes. That oil goes to Europe for reviving democracy in Europe. That is the reason it is so necessary now.
I can't help but disagree with you there again, Mr. Millis, as I've watched this administration since the death of President Roosevelt. I can't help but feel that we're trying to set up the same kind of a monopoly cartel system that we had after the First World War. We've begun by trying to rebuild a strong and industrial Germany. we have followed all the way down the line of trying to set up the same kind of a path which led us into the Second World War.
Well, Mr. Ruggie, I think that is taking us rather far away from the draft question. You said that the answer might be found in one word, Palestine. I couldn't help thinking that one of the viewpoints, as far as I know, in which Mr. Henry Wallace has advocated the use of force is precisely in Palestine. Without an army, we could do nothing there to fulfill the policies which Mr. Wallace has loudly advocated.
Well, I think Mr. Wallace wanted to operate through United Nations, and there again you have a strange thing. United Nations we bypass when we please, but when we come to a situation like Palestine, where there is a fair amount of agreement in United Nations with reference to it, we sabotage it.
Well, now let's come back from Palestine, gentlemen, to the draft as such. Waving aside for the moment, and I grant you it's the center of this whole discussion, waving aside from the moment the question of how much of a crisis exists, we still come to the question of the specific draft on whether or not that will solve any such crisis if it did exist. I believe your position, Mr. Roby, is that a draft won't work anyway, isn't it?
That's right. Even assuming that there were this crisis that Mr. Millis is talking about, and I want to be sure that I'm understood to challenge that major premise, and I also want to make the point that the draft looks to me like another face for universal military training. But having made those points...
Having made that point, I think you better wait a minute and let Mr. Miller say whether he thinks that the draft is another face of universal military training, since that certainly directly concerns you.
Well, it seems to me, Mr. Cook, that the draft might very well lead to the adoption of universal military training, but I distinguish the two, because universal military training, was actually a system devised to take care of our defensive requirements under a relatively peacetime establishment. That system was never put into adoption. We now find ourselves in a crisis, as I have suggested. We now need the draft to do what universal military training might have done, but did not, since it was never adopted.
Let's take that a step further, Mr. Millis, very specifically. The draft would then do what? Having had this 300,000 or 700,000 more men in an army somewhere from 1 million to 1,800,000, what do we do with it?
In the first place, the Army, it is now stated that the armed services, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, are about 340,000 men short of the peacetime establishment which was adopted immediately on the conclusion of the World War. The first necessity for a draft would be to fill up those ranks, which we always intended to fill by voluntary action anyway. I find it a little difficult to speak because the definite plans of the administration have not been made known. Therefore, it is impossible to criticize them. I would say, though, that the main purpose is to get a certain number of established formations which are in existence and can exert military pressure, not war, but military pressure by their very existence, much as the formations of the Soviet Army now do.
What I was going to say when I was making, I suppose, Mr. Miller's too long an introduction and with too many qualifications, even if there were the crisis that Mr. Millis talks about, I would still say that in the atomic age, thinking of it in terms of a draft is Maginot Line thinking. I have as authority for that really Hanson Baldwin, who's much more of an expert than I am, and I think, although he may have been referring to universal military training, it would also apply to the draft, that it's horse and buggy thinking in an atomic and missile age, even assuming that the crisis were there. The way to meet it would be with a small mobile force of experts who can handle missile weapons and things like that, but not by a large standing army.
It seems to me that Mr. Raggi has been making one of the most disastrous mistakes that many people do make now. If we rely on a small force of experts, which means a small force of large airplanes carrying atomic bombs, we can act only through the obliteration of Russians by the 100,000. That is all you can do with an atomic bomb. If, however, we have a small mobile force, something corresponding to the Marine divisions we used in the Pacific, you can exert diplomatic pressure at the places where it is needed without necessarily involving a war which would demand the slaughter of millions of people before any result could be achieved.
Well, now I would say, with reference to this diplomatic pressure in armed forces, what else have we been trying to do in Greece and in Turkey and now in Italy? I would ask, are there any Russian forces in Italy, and what are we afraid of at the moment? We're afraid of what seem to be elections in which the Russians aren't using any armed forces, and yet I think we do have some men staged in Italy. Are we afraid of the result of an election in which the people express themselves? And how much, I ask, how much benefit has our armed force been in the past year?
I think there's a quick answer, Mr. Raggi, to what we are afraid of. We are afraid of the capture of Italy by a minority an organized communist minority comparable to the capture of Czechoslovakia by the same methods.
In other words, you're afraid, Mr. Millis, that the Italian communists will take military means of their own inside the country, use force, and take over Italy? That's your great fear today?
Well, Mr. Cook, I think the Italian communists are trying to act exactly as the Czechoslovak communists acted in Czechoslovakia. It's a combination of direct military force, that is what are called the action committees, armed militias. It is a combination of intimidation, of organization, the net result of which is that a comparatively small minority of the country captures the country and thereafter renders it impossible for that country to escape the communist system, no matter how great a majority may later be against it.
All right, then, Mr. Millis, that leads to a second question before we turn to Mr. Rogge's side of this. Why will a draft enable the United States to help block Italian communists inside Italy taking over the Italian government?
Mr. Cook, I think the most important effect would be that if we adopt a draft, it will be a demonstration that the people of the United States stand ready to back up their principles, even by force if necessary, and even at considerable cost. Allow me merely to finish the thought. If that demonstration is made on the part of the American people, I think that a great many people in Italy, Italians, will be emboldened to resist the type of minority capture, minority pressure, to which otherwise they would be forced to yield through fear.
Well, I'm not wondering whether it wouldn't have exactly the opposite effect. I think we're going to have to recognize in this country that Europe, with its limited resources, is going to have, to some extent, and I can't say to what extent, nationalization of its basic industries, as well as breaking up with the large landed estates. I'd like to ask Mr. Millis a question. Suppose a majority of the people vote for communism. Are we supposed to fight that with our armed forces?
I do not think so, Mr. Rogge. I would point out that no such case has yet occurred since the rise of the Soviet Union. There is no case in which a clear and honest majority has been obtained for communism. So it's a good deal of a hypothetical question. If it took place, I confess, would be very little that we could do about it.
The thing that troubles me the most, Mr. Cook, and maybe I'm not following the discussion right down the line, but I have a point that I want to make in this connection. I really feel let's get rid of some of the generals and have more freedom in this country. I want us to stay above all the free people, and this draft is in the direction, it's following still more of the fascist blueprint. I sat at these loyalty hearings, and I've had my clients ask questions. Are you a member of PCA? Have you read the books of Theodore Dreiser, Howard Fast, and Leon Feuchtwanger? Did you go to the Stanley Theater, a public theater here in New York City, and see the picture Stoneflower? Those are the things that I've seen happen, and I know that we're losing our freedom in this country, and nothing is more essential than that, and this draft is going down the road of helping to lose still more of it for us.
Mr. Rogge, I think you're again wandering rather far from the point, which is the draft. It is certainly not the action of the such as you speak of, the examination into thought control, if you like. That's an entirely different subject. I see no evidence that the generals are enforcing their will on the country, or that a draft would give the generals any more command over the country than they have had in the past under conditions of universal service.
Well, I'd say two things as to that. In the first place, the draft, and to my mind, as I've said before, is but another face for universal military training. I think it'll suck us into that.
I accept that.
The draft, therefore, is part of the pattern which has shown itself on many fronts, all the way from the Thomas Committee to too much propaganda by the armed forces for a large standing army. It's all going down the direction of depriving us of our freedom. People are afraid today to say what they think, and I don't want to see us become that kind of a people.
Well, that is the argument to a kind of pattern. We have a specific question here. Should we adopt the draft? And should we do so for specific reasons, which I have tried to outline, seem to me to be impelling reasons? Mr. Rogge says it is a part of a pattern. And we can't talk in those terms. We have to ask what actions we are going to take, why we're going to take them.
Well, it seems to me, having asked you a couple of fairly sharp questions, Mr. Millis, I should do the same thing with Mr. Rogge here. You've brought the discussion to the point where it becomes logical to do so. Mr. Rogge, in terms of your fears and worries, you then have no fears of trouble or danger or urgent threat to the United States if, let us say, communists should take over even all of Western Europe? I'm pushing that question as far as possible.
Yes, you may push it, and I, with a lot of other people, the first time the word communism was used, I was very frightened of it. But the more I've gone along, the more that concerns me today is the loss of our own freedom. Now, I know, for instance, that the Nazis used communist scare to impose fascism or Nazism in Germany. Now, so I'd answer your question by saying this, that if the majority of the people of Italy or France, for instance, wanted communism in those countries, and I sometimes wonder whether we shouldn't define what we mean by communism, I'd have to add this. It's inconceivable to me that the people of those countries, even if they make changes, won't make them consistent with their own culture pattern. So that the results you're going to have in France of nationalization, if they have it to some extent, is going to be different from what it was in Russia. In Russia, you had totalitarianism under the czars. You've got it under the communists. They followed their culture pattern. We're going to follow ours. Ours is freedom. Let's keep it.
And their culture pattern, following it along the lines you see them doing it, Mr. Rogge, would not be a serious threat to the culture pattern and the freedoms of the United States.
That's right. I would have to say I'm primarily interested in this country, and I see a greater threat from the reactionaries who are in control of our government who want to see to it that the special few keep too much. Rather than see to it, I'd say let's arrange our system so that all the people in this country have a minimum of the good things of life. And I don't think you've got any communist threat here.
I would like to be very glad if Mr. Rogge would make it clear who the reactionaries who are in control of our country are. Most of the reactionaries I can think of, or at least they believe themselves that they have totally lost control of the country. It seems to me that Mr. Rogge is talking this. It seems to me that Mr. Rogge is talking this. It seems to me that Mr. Rogge is talking this. It seems to me that Mr. Rogge is talking this. It seems to me that Mr. Rogge is talking this. It seems to me that Mr. Rogge is talking this. It seems to me that Mr. Rogge is talking this. It seems to me that Mr. Rogge is talking this. It seems to me that Mr. Rogge is talking a series of fictions. He says that if these changes take place in Europe, they will be in accordance with the European culture patterns. I defy him to say that the change that recently took place in Czechoslovakia was in accordance with the democratic Czech culture pattern, although Czechoslovakia was a country in which nationalization had already been carried to a very large extent.
Well, now, Mr. Miller's brought up several things, and as he was talking, I started listing some of the people who I think are big business representatives in the present administration. You have Forrestal, you have Harriman, you have Snyder, you have Levitt. There were a whole fistful. There are more big business representatives with this administration than any administration I know of, and you also have more generals and admirals having key positions. I think there are 170 military men that have key positions with this administration.
Mr. Rogge, if I may interrupt, I think you're using a technique which was once justly celebrated in this country as the technique of the Red Network. You can list a dozen businessmen in the government, you can list a dozen generals. You can't prove by that business runs the country or the generals run the country.
All right, I'll go to other reports, and I'll point out to you that big business after taxes this last year made $17 billion, which you can compare with the $12,500,000 in the year before. I also call attention to the government's economic report of his economic advisors in January of this year, which brought out that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer.
Would you make the connection, Mr. Rogge, between those billions of profits and fascism and no threat from communism? Would you come back to the Senate?
Well, I say that our whole structure in this country, and it's just as Lincoln explained it one time with reference to the Dred Scott decision, I think it was. He pointed out how you have all various logs, they all fit together, they make a certain kind of a structure, therefore they hang together. So here, you have big business and military-minded men who are in control of this administration, and you have big business making more profits than it ever had before. You get rid of OPA, you oppose public housing. I could go into many more circumstances, and when you add it all up, to my mind, you can't help but say you've got the kind of a reaction in this country already that's but a short step from fascism, and they'll push it still farther if we aren't careful.
Well, it is the Red Network technique. Mr. Rogge has
You are not applied. You are not talking, Mr. Millicent, Red Network, not any radio network.
Oh, by no means, Mr. That was farthest from my mind. It is the old technique of picking out one or two people, then associating them with others. It is the technique which Mr. Rogge himself objected to a few minutes ago. It is the technique of saying that because this person is there, therefore he is in control. It proves nothing whatever about the actual state of our society, which remains by far the freest society, the one in which there is the greatest opportunity for the ordinary man, the one in which the wealth of the corporations to which he mentioned has promoted more than in any other society the well-being of the masses of the people in any other society we now know.
It seems to me that what you two gentlemen have been saying, your central position so far, can be summed up in two cartoons in this morning's paper. See if I'm right. Mr. Rogge, I saw one cartoon with a great witch labeled ignorance. You would also put on that witch the label big business, drawing a circle called war is inevitable around a dwindling and very pathetic picture of peace. Is that fair enough?
That's right.
And then, Mr. Millis, another cartoon in the same paper showed a group of congressmen arguing among themselves on top of a cliff which might be labeled freedom in the United States, and underneath that cliff, a great sickle is hacking it away so that it's ready to topple over. That's the center of your position, is it not?
That's very much, Mr. Cook.
Well, now we get two cartoons of two positions which are about as diametrically opposite as they could be.
May I recall another cartoon, Mr. Cook? This appeared in another newspaper some days ago. It represented Congress building the Marshall Plan. The representation was the Marshall Plan was a bridge between the United States and the distressed and starving peoples of Europe. And the bridge was being swung into place when some of the congressmen, represented as engineers, were making the suggestion that it was too expensive and perhaps we ought to take off a few feet from each end. The result, of course, would be that the bridge wouldn't reach.
Well, do you suppose that some of these congressmen might have seen the King and Queen of Greece and some of the reactionaries who have been getting our money on the other side? And by the way, I want to come back to something else. You say there were just a few. I could go on and list 20 or 30 big business representatives who hold one high post or another, Mr. Millis, in this administration, and I think some 170 military men. And I'd also like to make another comment when you talk about the pattern. You know, it's a strange thing. We can, you get measures for public housing, for things like soil conservation, for things like Missouri Valley Authority, and some things like that, St. Lawrence Waterway Project, that I'd like to see some of the money spent. We talk about, and again, I think I have Hanson Baldwin's figure, somewhere between 15 and 25 billion a year for this. And you know, when you talk, I want to finish my point. When you talk about a little money for things like public housing, they're opposed to that. But for the military, anything you want, you get it.
Mr. Rogge, I was still under the impression we were here to talk about the draft, and it seems to me that the essence of your argument is not relating to the draft, it's an attack upon the whole American system. The pattern, after all, is the pattern of our system by which we live. You're attacking the situation in the United States. You're not talking about the draft. I am merely saying that we have reached a point where, if we are to fulfill our system, if we are to continue the policies on which that system rests, if we are to defend the interests of this country in the world as it now exists and in the crisis that now exists, then the draft is a necessary part of it.
Well, Mr. Millis has said that I attack our system. I'd like to explain what I think is our best characteristic. I'd always regarded us, Mr. Cook and Mr. Millis, as a free people, a heterogeneous people. I dare say that there isn't an idea afoot in the world but what some American hasn't held it. And it's always been my idea of this country as a free people that person was entitled to say what came to his mind. Now, it's that characteristic of being a free people that we are losing, and in my opinion, the draft is one more thing to push us down the road where we are no longer that kind of a free people.
All right, as we express our opinions as free people this morning, gentlemen, let's take the next step here in terms of the draft. Let us suppose for the moment it's a double question in terms of what happens next if what is happening doesn't happen, a bad phrasing of it. Mr. Millis, if Congress will not pass the draft, what do we do then?
Mr. Cook, I don't see that we can do much except what we are endeavoring to do now. It seems to me that the draft is a necessary means to implement, if that somewhat unpleasant word can be used, to implement our present policy. Of course, if Congress refuses to pass the draft, our policy will fall short by that much.
And Mr. Rogge, if we do not have a draft now, what do we do instead now?
Well, I'd like to see us use some of the money that we use for the draft and use it for certain social improvements, for public housing, for a Missouri Valley Authority, for soil conservation, so that we make the most of our human and natural resources in this country. The fact that we don't pass the draft pleases me rather than troubles.
So, Mr. Rogge, you would then surrender our foreign policy as it now stands.
The Truman Doctrine has ended in complete bankruptcy. Yes, I say repeal the Truman Doctrine, and the sooner the better.
May I ask it in a little more specific fashion? You would resign Europe, Western Europe, to the Soviet Union, to Soviet imperialism.
No, I wouldn't put it that way, but I'll resign the different countries of Europe to the form of social structure which the people in those respective countries want. Let the Italians set up what kind of a system they want, and the French what kind of a system they want. And I say to you that you are not going to get a system there which is too inconsistent with their own existing culture pattern.
That is beyond your power to surrender the Italians to the kind of system they want unless you take those steps necessary to save the Italians from absorption or capture by the Soviet system, which they do not want.
Let's rephrase this whole discussion, gentlemen, in terms of the people who are listening, who are necessarily worried here. I'm sure all over this country there are millions of mothers and fathers who are wondering about their sons in the draft and the possible danger of war. And there are millions of boys between 18 and 25 who wonder whether they should be in the Army now, wonder whether they should be in the draft. What would you say to all these people, Mr. Millis?
I would say that the draft is not a very serious burden, that a great many of those boys themselves would not object to going into it, and that it is something that we properly should ask of the American people.
Mr. Augie, what would you say to the same group?
And I'd say to the same group, let's keep ourselves sound and strong. Let's go ahead and send those children on to college for the best training that they seek in whatever profession it may be. And I'd also like to say to labor, let's have a strong labor movement because labor is the backbone of democracy. And let's see that we establish a structure where everybody has a minimum of the good things of life, and there isn't a one among us who doesn't feel free to say whatever comes to his heart.
Now, this is a debate on the American democracy. It's not a debate on the steps necessary to fulfill that democracy.
Well, I think the best way to fulfill the American democracy, if you please, is to make us strong in the way that I've suggested, to build up a country where everyone has a certain minimum of the good things of life. And I'd further say this, Mr. Millis, I want to come back that even if there is the crisis, which you assume and which I question, that the way to handle that is not by putting our 18-year-olds in the Army, but you have to have a small trained force of technicians in this atomic and missile age, and you aren't going to train 18-year-olds to be that either in 6 months or in 1 year or in 2 years.
And, Mr. Rogge, in doing that, you abandon Western Europe to communism, where the only possible move you can ever take against it is to destroy Russia with atomic bombs. That seems to me a savage and a cruel policy.
Well, of course, throwing atom bombs on Russia, there are people in this country who want to do that now. But I question your assumption, Mr. Millis, that what we're doing is abandoning Europe. I say that you'll turn Europe over to the peoples of the respective countries without our own military forces.
You question each other's assumptions a good deal, gentlemen, but in that process you brought out a good many facts. A recent AP poll this morning showed that some 57 senators are undecided what to do about the draft in universal military training. You brought out a good many of the arguments pro and con and what they should do.
You have been listening to a debate on the question, should the draft be restored now, as heard at home on People's Platform. Speaking in the affirmative was Walter Millis, editorial writer for the New York Herald Tribune, and opposed was O. John Rogge, former special assistant to the Attorney General. The summary was briefed by the moderator, Dwight Cook, chairman of the People's Platform. The opinions expressed were not necessarily those of the armed forces of the United States. This is the United States Armed Forces Radio Service, the voice of information and education.